Tonight, we will explore the extraordinary life and legacy of Leonardo da Vinci, one of the most remarkable and wide-ranging minds in the history of human civilization. As you relax and unwind, you will hear 100 fascinating facts about his paintings, his inventions, his scientific investigations, and the remarkable curiosity that carried him through one of the most extraordinary lives any person has ever lived. There is no need to stay awake for every detail. Simply listen, rest, and let the story of Leonardo da Vinci gently guide you towards sleep. Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci was born on the 15th of April, 1452, in the small Tuscan hill town of Vinci, located in the Arno Valley between Florence and Pisa. The illegitimate son of a Florentine notary named Ser Piero da Vinci and a young peasant woman named Caterina di Meo Lippi. His illegitimate birth, which would have closed certain professional doors to him had he pursued his father's career in law or notary work, may paradoxically have contributed to the freedom with which he eventually chose to pursue painting and the wide range of intellectual interests that would define his life. He was raised initially by his mother before being taken into the household of his paternal grandfather, and he grew up in the countryside around Vinci, surrounded by the Tuscan landscape, the hills, the rivers, the quality of light across the valley that would later appear, transformed and deepened, in the backgrounds of his most celebrated paintings. Leonardo's mother, Caterina, about whom relatively little is known with certainty, appears to have remained a presence in his life long after he was taken into his father's household, and a woman named Caterina who came to live with him in Milan in 1493 and who died there 2 years later, is believed by most scholars to have been his mother, making the circumstances of her final years and her relationship with her famous son one of the more quietly moving details of his biography. The limited documentary record of Caterina's life reflects the broader invisibility of women of her social position in the historical record of the period, and the few traces she leaves in Leonardo's notebooks and account books, a record of expenses for her funeral, a list of items purchased for her care, have been studied carefully by biographers seeking to understand the emotional reality of a relationship that the official record almost entirely obscures. Leonardo entered the workshop of the Florentine painter and sculptor Andrea del Verrocchio at approximately the age of 14, beginning an apprenticeship that would last for several years and that provided him with a comprehensive technical education in the full range of skills required by a major Florentine workshop of the period. Verrocchio's workshop was one of the most prestigious and productive in Florence, engaged in commissions ranging from paintings and sculptures to goldsmiths' work, bronze casting, and the design of ceremonial objects, and the breadth of the workshop's activities gave Leonardo an unusually wide technical foundation that encompassed both the fine arts and the practical crafts in ways that would influence the direction of his intellectual interest for the rest of his life. Several of the most significant artists of the generation were trained in Verrocchio's workshop, and the quality of technical instruction it provided was widely recognized as among the finest available in Florence. The story that Verrocchio, upon seeing the quality of the angel that Leonardo painted in their collaborative work on the baptism of Christ, he was so overwhelmed by his apprentice's superiority that he vowed never to paint again, is one of the most frequently repeated anecdotes in the history of Renaissance art, and one whose truth cannot be verified, but whose persistence reflects a genuine recognition of the extraordinary quality that Leonardo's contribution to the painting displays. The angel in the baptism of Christ, which now hangs in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, is clearly distinguishable from the rest of the painting by the quality of its modeling, the subtlety of its expression, and the atmospheric softness of the landscape behind it, qualities that go considerably beyond what the rest of the painting demonstrates, and that give the anecdote a visual plausibility that purely legendary stories rarely possess. Leonardo was registered as a master in the Florentine Guild of Painters in 1472 at the age of 20, which technically qualified him to establish his own workshop and accept independent commissions, but he continued to work in association with Verrocchio's workshop for several more years before establishing himself fully independently. The decision to remain within the established workshop environment, rather than striking out immediately on his own, reflects a pragmatism and a patience that are not always associated with Leonardo's character in popular accounts, but that are visible throughout his career in the careful way he navigated the institutional and patronage structures of Renaissance Italian art. The guild registration also marks the formal beginning of his independent professional life as an artist, though the first major independent commissions would not materialize until several years later. Leonardo's earliest surviving dated work is a drawing of the Arno Valley landscape made on the 5th of August, 1473, which he inscribed with the date in his characteristic mirror writing, and which shows a panoramic view of a river valley with hills, fields, and a castle in the distance, rendered with a freshness and atmospheric sensitivity that demonstrates the quality of his observational drawing at the age of 21. The drawing is significant not only as the earliest datable work in his hand, but as an early demonstration of the relationship between his scientific interest in natural phenomena, the movement of water, the formation of geological features, the quality of atmospheric haze, and his artistic practice of depicting those phenomena with a precision and subtlety that went beyond the conventional requirements of landscape drawing in the period. The landscape backgrounds of his later paintings grow directly from the sensibility already visible in this early drawing. The Adoration of the Magi, commissioned in 1481 from the monastery of San Donato a Scopeto near Florence, and left unfinished when Leonardo departed for Milan the following year, is one of the most discussed and most carefully studied of all his works, precisely because its unfinished state reveals with unusual clarity the process by which he developed a complex, multi-figure composition from its initial conception to its final form. The painting exists in a state between drawing and painting, the compositional structure fully established in underdrawing, the figures modelled in brown earth tones, but the colour and final surface never applied that gives it a quality of suspended animation, a work caught in the moment between conception and completion. The complexity of the composition, with its crowd of figures surrounding the central group of the Virgin and Child and the three kings, went far beyond anything that had been attempted in previous treatments of the subject, and set a standard for narrative complexity that would influence the development of Italian painting for generations. Leonardo arrived in Milan around 1482 at the age of 30, and spent approximately 17 years in the city under the patronage of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, a period that proved to be the most productive and the most professionally stable of his entire career, and that produced some of the most significant works of his life. He presented himself to Ludovico not primarily as a painter, but as a military engineer, musician, and designer of theatrical spectacles, listing his abilities in a letter that mentioned painting and sculpture, almost as afterthoughts following an extensive description of his capabilities in the design of bridges, weapons, siege engines, and water systems. The strategy reflected a clear-eyed assessment of what a court patron needed and what Leonardo could offer, and it secured him a position at the Sforza court that gave him the financial stability and the intellectual freedom to pursue the extraordinary range of investigations that characterize his Milan notebooks. The Virgin of the Rock, of which Leonardo painted two versions, one now in the Louvre in Paris and one in the National Gallery in London, was commissioned in 1483 for an altarpiece in the Chapel of the Immaculate Conception in Milan, and became the subject of a prolonged legal dispute between Leonardo and the confraternity that commissioned it that lasted for more than 2 decades. The dispute arose from disagreements about the content of the painting and the additional decorative elements that were to surround it, and it resulted in Leonardo eventually producing a second version of the composition to satisfy the terms of the commission, while the first version was sold elsewhere, a practical resolution that left both versions in existence and that has given art historians 2 closely related paintings to compare and contrast in their investigations of Leonardo's technique and working process. The 2 versions differ in subtle but significant ways that continue to generate scholarly discussion. The Last Supper, painted on the end wall of the refectory of the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan between approximately 1495 and 1498, is one of the most celebrated and most analysed paintings in the history of Western art, depicting the moment described in the Gospel of John when Christ announces to his disciples that one of them will betray him. Leonardo chose to depict the instant of psychological shock and reaction that follows Christ's announcement rather than the more conventional moment of the institution of the Eucharist, giving him the opportunity to explore the full range of human emotional response: surprise, denial, anger, grief, guilt, across the faces and gestures of the 12 apostles arranged along the table. The painting was executed not in true fresco, but in a mixed technique of tempera and oil on a dry plaster ground that allowed Leonardo the slow and reflective working pace he preferred, but that proved disastrously unsuited to the damp conditions of the refectory wall and began to deteriorate within Leonardo's own lifetime. The deterioration of the Last Supper began almost immediately after its completion and has continued at varying rates across the 5 centuries since it was painted, making it one of the most frequently and most controversially restored works in the history of art, and raising persistent questions about how much of what the visitor sees today in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie represent Leonardo's original work, and how much represents the accumulated interventions of the restorers who have worked on it over the centuries. The most recent and most comprehensive restoration, completed in 1999 after 21 years of work, removed several layers of earlier restoration materials and revealed surfaces that its conservators believed to be closer to Leonardo's original intentions than anything visible for several centuries. But the restoration was also criticized by some scholars who felt that the process had removed too much of the historical accretion that had become part of the painting's identity over time. Leonardo's notebooks, of which approximately 5,000 pages survive out of an estimated original total of more than 13,000, represent one of the most extraordinary intellectual documents in human history, a record of observations, investigations, speculations, and designs across an astonishing range of subjects that gives a more complete picture of the workings of a single human mind than almost any comparable source from any period. The notebooks contain drawings and written observations on anatomy, geology, hydraulics, optics, botany, astronomy, architecture, military engineering, painting theory, music, and dozens of other subjects, all written in Leonardo's characteristic mirror script from right to left in a hand that could only be read in a mirror, that has given rise to various theories about his reasons for writing this way, from the practical convenience of a left-handed writer to a deliberate desire to make his notes difficult for others to read. Leonardo's mirror writing, which he used consistently throughout his notebooks and personal documents, was almost certainly a natural and practical adaptation rather than a deliberate act of secrecy or mystification, reflecting the particular convenience for a left-handed writer of moving the pen from right to left across the page rather than from left to right in the conventional direction that caused left-handed writers to smear the ink they had just laid down. The theory that the mirror writing was a deliberate code or cipher has been largely abandoned by scholars, who note that the writing can be read relatively easily by anyone who holds the page to a mirror, and that Leonardo appears to have used it consistently across documents of all kinds, including those that would have needed to be read by others, suggesting that it was simply his natural way of writing, rather than an attempt to conceal his ideas from potential readers. Leonardo's anatomical investigations, conducted through the dissection of human corpses at various hospitals in Florence and Milan over several decades, produced a body of drawings of extraordinary scientific and artistic quality that represent the most accurate and the most beautiful anatomical illustrations produced before the modern era, and that were not surpassed as scientific documents until the development of medical imaging in the 20th century. He is estimated to have dissected more than 30 human bodies over the course of his career, recording his observations in detailed drawings accompanied by written notes that demonstrate the depth and precision of his understanding of the body's internal structure, the relationship between bone and muscle, the mechanics of the joints, the organization of the cardiovascular and nervous systems, at a level of accuracy that went far beyond anything available in the medical literature of his time. The drawing known as the Vitruvian Man, produced around 1490 and now held in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice, is one of the most recognized images in the history of Western art, and one that represents Leonardo's engagement with the classical theory of human proportion derived from the Roman architect Vitruvius, who had described the ideal human body as one that could be inscribed simultaneously within a circle and a square. Leonardo's drawing shows a male figure in two superimposed positions, arms and legs apart, inscribed in a circle, arms extended and legs together inscribed in a square with detailed written notes about the proportional relationships between the different parts of the body. The drawing is not simply an illustration of Vitruvius's theory, but a critical engagement with it, and the precision of the proportional measurements it records reflects Leonardo's characteristic approach to receive knowledge, not accepting it on authority, but testing it against direct observation and measurement. Leonardo's painting of Cecilia Gallerani, known as Lady with an Ermine, and painted around 1489 to 1490, is one of the finest and most psychologically penetrating portraits of the Renaissance, and one that demonstrates the extraordinary advance in the depiction of human personality and inner life that Leonardo brought to the art of portraiture. Cecilia Gallerani was the mistress of Ludovico Sforza, and the painting shows her holding a white ermine, an animal associated with purity and with the Sforza family, in a pose of animated intelligence that seems to capture her in the middle of a thought, or a conversation rather, than in the static composure of conventional portraiture. The turn of her head, the quality of attention in her eyes, and the sense of a personality fully present in the moment of the painting give the work a quality of psychological immediacy that had no real precedent in the portraiture of the period. The Sforza horse, also known as the Gran Cavallo, was a monumental bronze equestrian statue commissioned by Ludovico Sforza as a tribute to his father Francesco, and intended to be the largest bronze sculpture ever cast, a project that Leonardo worked on for more than a decade before it was ultimately never completed, due to the military and political upheavals that brought the Sforza regime to an end. Leonardo produced extensive drawings and studies for the project, and constructed a full-scale clay model, approximately 7 meters tall, that was displayed publicly in Milan in 1493. But the 75 tons of bronze that had been set aside for the casting were diverted by Ludovico to make cannons when the French invasion of 1494 threatened the Sforza state. The clay model was subsequently destroyed by French soldiers who used it for target practice, leaving only the drawings and the memory of the project as evidence of what would have been the most ambitious, bronze casting of the Renaissance. Leonardo left Milan in 1499 when the French army of Louis XII invaded and the Sforza regime collapsed, beginning a period of movement between Italian cities Venice, Mantua, Florence, Cesena that reflected both the political instability of the period and the difficulty of finding a new patron whose resources and interests matched what Ludovico's court had been able to provide. He spent time in the service of Cesare Borgia, the ruthless and brilliant son of Pope Alexander VI, working as a military engineer and mapper during Borgia's campaigns of territorial expansion in central Italy in 1502 and 1503, an experience that gave him access to a wide range of practical engineering problems and that produced some of the most remarkable maps ever made, precisely observed, carefully drawn, and astonishing in their accuracy given the surveying tools available at the time. The Mona Lisa, painted in Florence between approximately 1503 and 1517, and now the most famous painting in the world, depicts a woman whose identity has been the subject of scholarly debate for centuries, with the most widely accepted identification being Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo, who is believed to have commissioned the portrait around 1503. The painting is remarkable for a range of technical and compositional innovations, including the sfumato technique, the application of extremely thin glazes of paint to create soft transitions between tones without hard edges. That gives the figure its characteristic quality of atmospheric softness and psychological depth, and the enigmatic expression of the subject, which seems to shift between a smile and a more neutral expression depending on where the viewer focuses their attention, has made it the object of more analysis and more popular fascination than any other painting in history. The sfumato technique that Leonardo developed, and that is most perfectly realized in the Mona Lisa, involves the application of multiple extremely thin layers of translucent paint, some so thin as to be almost imperceptible, individually built up over long periods to create tonal transitions of extraordinary smoothness and subtlety that give the painted surface a quality of depth and luminosity that no other technique can replicate. Analysis of the Mona Lisa using modern imaging technology has revealed that the sfumato layers in the painting are each only a few micrometers thick, thinner than a human hair, and that their accumulation over what must have been a very long period of work produces a surface whose optical qualities are fundamentally different from those of paint applied in conventional layers. The technique requires extraordinary patience and an almost impossibly fine control of the painting instrument, and it represents one of the most demanding technical achievements in the history of painting. Leonardo returned to Milan in 1508, this time under the patronage of the French governor Charles d'Amboise, and spent several years in the city engaged in a range of projects including architectural designs, hydraulic engineering schemes, and the continuation of his anatomical investigations in collaboration with the physician Marcantonio della Torre, whose early death from plague in 1511 brought to an end what might have been one of the most productive scientific collaborations of the Renaissance. The collaboration with della Torre represented a coming together of artistic and scientific investigation that Leonardo had always pursued individually, and that the partnership with a trained physician was beginning to systematize in ways that could have produced a comprehensive illustrated anatomy, a project that Leonardo had been working toward throughout his career, but that, like so many of his most ambitious projects, was never completed. Leonardo's investigations into the flight of birds, which he pursued across several decades and recorded in a dedicated notebook known as the Codex on the Flight of Birds, produced some of the most detailed and most accurate observations of avian flight mechanics made before the modern era, and they were directly connected to his sustained interest in the possibility of human flight and his designs for flying machines that attempted to replicate the mechanisms he observed in birds and bats. He designed multiple flying machines over the course of his career, including an ornithopter, a machine with flapping wings driven by human muscle power, and a device resembling a modern helicopter, whose rotating screw was intended to compress the air beneath it and generate lift. None of the designs were ever built during his lifetime, and the ornithopter designs in particular would not have been capable of sustained flight given the power-to-weight ratio of human muscle, but the quality of the aerodynamic thinking behind them demonstrates an understanding of the principles of flight that was centuries ahead of its time. Leonardo moved to Rome in 1513 under the patronage of Giuliano de' Medici, the brother of the newly elected Pope Leo X, and spent approximately 3 years in the city, engaged in a range of projects that included optical experiments, geological investigations, and the design of a small bronze horse, but that produced relatively little painting, a fact that has led biographers to describe the Roman period as one of the least productive of his career, despite the richness of the intellectual environment it provided. He was given rooms in the Belvedere of the Vatican and access to the resources of the papal court, but the specific projects he was given to work on did not align well with his current interests, and the presence in Rome of Michelangelo and Raphael, both working at the height of their powers on the most ambitious commissions of their careers, may have contributed to a sense of displacement that the documentary record of his Roman years seems to reflect. Leonardo departed Italy for France in 1516 at the age of 64, accepting an invitation from the French king Francis I to come to the royal court at Amboise as premier painter, architect, and engineer of the king, a title that gave him a position of honor and a generous income in exchange for his presence at court and his participation in the intellectual life Francis was cultivating around himself. Francis provided Leonardo with a manor house called the Château du Clos Lucé near the royal castle of Amboise in the Loire Valley, a comfortable and well-appointed residence connected to the royal castle by an underground passage that allowed the king to visit Leonardo easily and frequently, and the relationship between the elderly painter and the young king appears to have been one of genuine mutual affection and intellectual stimulation that provided Leonardo with a quality of recognition and personal warmth in his final years that his earlier patrons had not always offered. Leonardo da Vinci died on the 2nd of May 1519 at the Château du Clos Lucé in Amboise at the age of 67, in the presence of his devoted assistant and companion, Francesco Melzi, who had been with him since his Milan years and who would devote the remainder of his own life to the preservation and organization of the notebooks and drawings that Leonardo left behind. The account of his death, given by Giorgio Vasari, in which Francis I holds Leonardo in his arms as he dies, a scene of remarkable intimacy between a monarch and an artist that may be more symbolic than literal, reflects the degree to which the relationship between the two men had become, in the cultural memory of the following century, a symbol of the ideal relationship between a generous and enlightened patron and the supreme creative genius of the age. Leonardo was buried in the chapel of Saint Florentin at the Château of Amboise, though his remains were later disturbed and their current location is not entirely certain. Leonardo's relationship with his father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was distant and complicated by the circumstances of his birth, and the two men never appear to have developed the close bond that might have been expected between a father and his eldest son, despite the fact that Leonardo was eventually brought into the paternal household and given an education appropriate to his father's social position. Ser Piero was a successful notary who fathered 12 legitimate children with 4 successive wives across the course of his long life, and Leonardo's illegitimate status meant that he was excluded from the inheritance and the professional succession that would have been available to a legitimate son. His father died in 1504, and Leonardo's notebook entry recording the death is notable for its almost clinical brevity, a date, a time, and a few words in contrast to the elaborate emotional responses that appear elsewhere in his writing, a restraint that has been read by biographers as evidence of the emotional distance between the two men that had characterized their relationship throughout Leonardo's life. The Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, a large painting on which Leonardo worked for an extended period and which now hangs in the Louvre in Paris, exists alongside a cartoon, a full-scale preparatory drawing in the National Gallery in London, that differs significantly from the finished painting in its composition, and that provides a rare opportunity to compare. Leonardo's initial conception of a major work with the version he eventually brought to completion, the cartoon, which was exhibited publicly in Florence around 1501 and caused a sensation among the artists and citizens who came to see it, shows the Virgin seated on her mother Anne's lap with the infant Christ reaching toward a lamb, while the painting in the Louvre rearranges the figures in a more complex spiral composition and introduces a different quality of atmospheric landscape behind them. The comparison between the two versions reveals how substantially Leonardo continued to develop and refine his compositions between the initial conception and the final execution, and how the process of revision was for him as much a creative act as the initial invention. Leonardo's investigation of geology and the formation of the Earth produced observations and conclusions that were significantly ahead of the geological thinking of his time, including his recognition that the fossilized marine shells found in the mountains of northern Italy were the remains of actual sea creatures that had lived and died in an ancient sea that once covered the land, rather than objects placed there by God or carried there by the biblical flood, as conventional opinion maintained. He argued from the evidence of the fossils and the rock strata in which they were embedded that the Earth had undergone a long and complex history of geological change over a period of time that could not be reconciled with the chronology provided by the Bible, a conclusion that was as theologically radical as it was scientifically accurate, and that demonstrates the degree to which his commitment to direct observation over received authority led him toward insights that the intellectual framework of his time was not equipped to accommodate. Leonardo's designs for urban planning, produced in Milan in the aftermath of the plague epidemic of 1484 and 1485 that killed approximately 1/3 of the city's population, proposed a comprehensive reorganization of the city into a series of interconnected levels in which pedestrian traffic, commercial activity, and water supply and drainage would each occupy a separate layer of the urban fabric, preventing the overcrowding and contamination of water supplies that he correctly identified as the primary causes of the epidemic's severity. The designs were never implemented, and the Milan of Leonardo's time continued to be organized much as it had been before the plague. But the thinking behind them, the idea of the city as a system of interconnected flows that could be designed and managed to promote health and efficiency, anticipates principles of urban planning that would not be formally developed until several centuries later and that are still relevant to contemporary thinking about the design of cities. Leonardo's painting of Ginevra de' Benci, produced in Florence around 1474 to 1478, and now held in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, is the only painting by Leonardo in the Americas, and one of the earliest works in which his distinctive approach to portraiture, the three-quarter view, the psychological depth, the atmospheric landscape background, is fully visible. The painting shows a young Florentine noblewoman against a background of juniper, a visual pun on her name, since the Italian for juniper is ginepro, and it is remarkable for the quality of the subject's expression, which combines intelligence and reserve in a way that gives the painting a psychological complexity unusual in portraiture of the period. The back of the panel bears a painted wreath of juniper, palm, and laurel surrounding a motto that translates as "Beauty adorns virtue," suggesting that the panel may originally have included a depiction of her hands, now lost, that would have given the composition its full intended meaning. Leonardo's investigations into the behavior of water, which he pursued across several decades and recorded in thousands of drawings and written observations, produced one of the most comprehensive bodies of hydrological knowledge assembled by any individual before the modern era, encompassing the movement of rivers, the formation of waves, the behavior of water in confined channels, the patterns of erosion and deposition, and the mechanics of whirlpools and turbulence. He observed that water moving around an obstacle formed patterns of turbulence that resembled the patterns he observed in other natural phenomena: the curling of hair, the movement of wind through grass, the formation of clouds. And he pursued this insight toward a general theory of fluid dynamics that anticipated concepts not formally developed until the 19th and 20th centuries. The drawings of water in motion that fill his notebooks are simultaneously scientific observations and works of extraordinary visual beauty, demonstrating the characteristic fusion of analytical intelligence and aesthetic sensibility that defines his approach to every subject he investigated. The Codex Leicester, a notebook of approximately 72 pages that Leonardo compiled around 1508 to 1510, and that contains his investigations into the nature of water, the movement of the earth, the luminosity of the moon, and the formation of fossils, is the only major Leonardo manuscript in private hands and is now owned by the technology entrepreneur Bill Gates, who purchased it at auction in 1994 for $30.8 million. Gates had the manuscript digitized and made available in various digital formats shortly after its purchase, a decision that gave the general public access to Leonardo's writing and drawing in a form that the physical manuscript's private ownership would otherwise have prevented, and that reflected a genuine appreciation for the significance of the document and a commitment to its wider accessibility that the auction price alone might not have suggested. Leonardo's relationship with his pupil and companion Gian Giacomo Caprotti da Oreno, known universally as Salai, a nickname meaning "little devil" that Leonardo himself gave him, was one of the most enduring and most discussed personal relationships of his life, lasting from the time Salai entered his household as a 10-year-old boy in 1490 until Leonardo's death nearly 30 years later. Salai was by all accounts beautiful, charming, and thoroughly dishonest, stealing from Leonardo repeatedly and causing him considerable practical difficulties over the years, and Leonardo's written descriptions of his behavior in the notebooks make clear that he was well aware of these qualities. Despite this, he kept Salai with him for almost his entire adult life, included him in his will, and appears to have maintained toward him a quality of tolerant and possibly affectionate exasperation that defies easy categorization, and that has been the subject of extensive biographical speculation about the nature of their relationship. Leonardo's investigations into optics, the science of light and vision, were driven by his conviction that the painter needed to understand the physical mechanisms of sight in order to represent the visual world accurately, and they produced observations about the behavior of light that anticipated principles not formally established until centuries later. He understood that the eye does not see objects directly but receives light reflected from them, and he investigated the relationship between the intensity of a light source and the clarity of the shadows it cast, the way color changes in different qualities of light, and the phenomenon of simultaneous contrast, the effect by which colors appear to change depending on the colors that surround them. His observations about the way the atmosphere scatters light and reduces the clarity and color saturation of distant objects, the phenomenon he described as aerial perspective and used systematically in his landscape backgrounds, were the most sophisticated treatment of the subject available in the art of his time. The painting known as the Salvator Mundi, depicting Christ as the Saviour of the world holding a crystal orb and raising his right hand in blessing. They were sold at auction in New York in November 2017 for $450 million, making it, at that time, the most expensive painting ever sold at auction, a result that generated considerable controversy given the ongoing scholarly debate about the extent of Leonardo's personal involvement in the painting and the degree to which it may have been produced with workshop assistance. The attribution of the Salvator Mundi to Leonardo has been contested by a number of prominent scholars who argue that the quality of execution in certain passages of the painting falls below the standard of his accepted autograph works, while others have defended the attribution on the basis of technical analysis and documentary evidence. The painting's astronomical auction price has made the attribution question one of the most publicly discussed debates in contemporary art history. Leonardo's designs for theatrical spectacles and court entertainments, which he produced throughout his time at the Sforza court in Milan, demonstrate a dimension of his creative activity that his reputation as a painter and scientist has tended to overshadow, but that was taken very seriously by his contemporaries, and that drew on the full range of his abilities in design, engineering, and the creation of spectacular visual effects. He designed elaborate mechanical stage sets, costumes, and special effects for court masks and pageants that used his engineering ingenuity to create theatrical illusions, automated mechanical figures, moving scenery, dramatic lighting effects that were the most technologically sophisticated theatrical productions of the period. The design of these entertainments drew on the same understanding of mechanics, optics, and human movement that informed his scientific investigations, and the notebooks contain drawings related to theatrical design, alongside observations on anatomy and hydraulics that reflect how completely integrated his various areas of interest were in his own thinking. Leonardo's interest in music was not merely appreciative but practical and theoretical, and he was, by all accounts, an accomplished musician who played the lyre with considerable skill and who had developed his own version of the instrument, a lyre in the shape of a horse's skull, made of silver, that he brought to the Sforza court in Milan in 1482 as a gift and as a demonstration of his abilities. He thought seriously about the relationship between music and painting, identifying both as arts that worked through sensory experience to produce emotional effects, and he developed theoretical arguments about the relative merits of the two arts that reflect a depth of engagement with musical aesthetics unusual in a visual artist. His notebooks contain observations about musical acoustics and the physics of sound, alongside his investigations into optics and the physics of light, reflecting the characteristic tendency to pursue questions across disciplinary boundaries wherever the logic of the investigation led him. The town of Vinci, where Leonardo was born, maintains a museum dedicated to his life and work, the Museo Leonardiano, that holds an extensive collection of models constructed from his engineering drawings and that provides one of the most accessible introductions to the process, range, and ingenuity of his technical designs available anywhere. The museum is housed partly in the medieval castle that dominates the town and partly in a neighboring building, and the models it contains reconstructions of his flying machines, his hydraulic devices, his military equipment, and his mechanical automata give physical form to designs that exist only as drawings in the notebooks, and that demonstrate the degree to which Leonardo's technical thinking was practically oriented rather than purely theoretical. The town itself retains something of the quiet Tuscan character that he would have grown up in, and the landscape visible from the castle, the hills, the olive groves, the quality of the Arno Valley light, connects the visitor to the specific environment that shaped his earliest visual experience. Leonardo's painting technique, which he developed across his career in ways that became increasingly distinctive and increasingly removed from the conventions of his contemporaries, was characterized above all by an extreme slowness and deliberateness that made him one of the least productive of all the major Renaissance painters in terms of the number of finished works he left behind. He is generally credited with fewer than 20 paintings, a remarkably small output for a career spanning more than 4 decades, and the slowness of his working process was a consistent source of frustration for his patrons, who frequently commissioned works that were never completed or that took far longer to finish than any reasonable expectation could have justified. His contemporary biographer, Giorgio Vasari, noted that Leonardo had a habit of beginning works with great enthusiasm that gradually gave way to a kind of perfectionist paralysis, in which the impossibility of achieving the standard he had set for himself made it increasingly difficult to continue. Francesco Melzi, the young Milanese nobleman who joined Leonardo's household around 1506 and who remained his devoted companion until his death in 1519, inherited all of Leonardo's notebooks, drawings, and personal possessions, and spent the decades following Leonardo's death organizing and preserving the manuscripts with a care and dedication that was essential to their survival. Melzi produced a compilation of Leonardo's writings on painting known as the Trattato della Pittura, drawing on the relevant passages scattered through the notebooks and organizing them into a coherent text that was eventually published decades after Melzi's own death, as the first systematic presentation of Leonardo's ideas about art to a wide audience. The notebooks themselves were less carefully preserved after Melzi's death, passing through various hands and being dispersed across collections in Italy, France, Spain, England, and elsewhere in ways that make the reconstruction of their original organization a complex and ongoing scholarly project. Leonardo's investigations into human emotion and its expression in the face and body, which he pursued both as a scientific question about the mechanisms by which inner states produce outer signs, and as a practical question about how a painter could most effectively convey the psychological reality of his subjects, produced some of the most sophisticated thinking about the relationship between mind and body available in the art or science of his time. He studied the muscles of the face with the same anatomical precision he brought to the study of the muscles of the arm or the leg, mapping their attachments and their actions in order to understand how specific emotional states produce specific configurations of the facial features. The application of this anatomical knowledge to the painting of faces gave his figures a quality of psychological depth and emotional plausibility that his contemporaries recognized as extraordinary, and that remains one of the most immediately striking qualities of his surviving paintings. The Burlington House cartoon, a large drawing in charcoal and chalk now held in the National Gallery in London, depicts the Virgin and Child with St. Anne and St. John the Baptist in a composition of extraordinary tenderness and formal beauty that represents one of the finest drawings Leonardo ever produced, and one of the most moving works in the history of Renaissance art. The drawing shows the 4 figures arranged in a compact pyramidal group, with Anne's arm around the Virgin's shoulder and the 2 children reaching toward each other across the composition in a network of gestures and glances that creates a quality of intimate familial warmth within a monumental, formal structure. The sfumato modeling of the faces and the quality of the atmospheric light that falls across the group give the drawing a painterly richness unusual in a work on paper, and demonstrate the degree to which Leonardo's painting practices were continuous with each other rather than distinct. Leonardo's investigation of the human heart, which he conducted through the dissection of ox hearts as well as human ones, produced drawings of the cardiac anatomy and observations about the mechanics of the heart's action that were the most accurate and the most detailed available anywhere before the modern era, and that anticipated by centuries the understanding of cardiac function that would eventually be established through systematic, scientific investigation. He correctly identified the 4 chambers of the heart and their functions, understood the mechanics of the heart valves, and observed the helical flow of blood through the cardiac chambers that would not be confirmed by modern science until the development of magnetic resonance imaging in the late 20th century. The accuracy of his cardiac observations is all the more remarkable given that he was working without the ability to observe the living heart in action and had to reconstruct its mechanics entirely from the static evidence of dissected specimens and his own reasoning about what their structure implied about their function. The Codex Atlanticus, the largest surviving collection of Leonardo's drawings and writings, comprises approximately 1,200 pages of drawings and notes on subjects ranging from military engineering and hydraulics to mathematics, natural philosophy, and the fine arts, and is now held in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan, where it has been since the early 17th century. The collection takes its name from the large atlas format paper on which the drawings were mounted by the sculptor Pompeo Leoni in the late 16th century, who acquired a large portion of Leonardo's papers after they passed through various hands following Melzi's death, and organized them in a way that mixed drawings from different periods and on different subjects in a manner that has made the reconstruction of the original notebook's organization one of the more complex problems in Leonardo's studies. The Codex is now available in a complete digitized edition that has made its contents accessible to researchers and the general public in ways that the physical manuscript's location in a library archive would otherwise have prevented. Leonardo's design for a giant crossbow, recorded in a drawing in the Codex Atlanticus that shows a machine approximately 24 meters wide with a mechanism for bending the bow powered by a system of screws and levers, is one of the most dramatic of his military engineering designs, and one that demonstrates the characteristic combination of practical ingenuity and monumental scale that defined his approach to the design of weapons and fortifications. He produced extensive designs for military equipment throughout his career, including improved versions of existing weapons such as cannons and crossbows, designs for armored vehicles that anticipate the modern tank, and proposals for novel weapons, including a steam-powered cannon and a device for scattering projectiles over a wide area. Whether any of these designs were ever built or tested is in most cases unclear, and scholars debate the degree to which they were serious practical proposals as opposed to theoretical explorations of mechanical principles. Leonardo's relationship with mathematics was that of a visual thinker rather than a formal mathematician, and his engagement with mathematical questions was typically driven by their practical applications to problems in art, engineering, or natural philosophy, rather than by an interest in mathematics as an abstract discipline pursued for its own sake. He collaborated with the Franciscan friar and mathematician Luca Pacioli, who spent time at the Sforza court in Milan in the late 1490s, and whose treatise on divine proportion for the mathematical ratio known as the golden section, Leonardo illustrated with drawings of geometric solids that are among the most beautiful mathematical illustrations ever produced. The collaboration with Pacioli gave Leonardo access to a more systematic treatment of mathematical ideas than he had previously encountered, and appears to have deepened his engagement with geometry in ways that are visible in the encountered, increasingly precise spatial organization of his later work. The red chalk drawing of an elderly bearded man, held in the Royal Library at Turin and generally identified as a self-portrait made when Leonardo was in his 60s, is one of the most familiar images associated with his name, and one that has shaped the popular conception of what he looked like more thoroughly than any other surviving representation. The drawing shows a man of striking appearance, a broad forehead, deep-set eyes, a long nose, and an abundant beard and moustache, rendered with the same quality of sustained observational attention that Leonardo brought to his anatomical drawings. And the expression of the face combines intelligence, age, and a quality of inward reflection that has made the image seem to many viewers like a self-portrait in a deeper sense than simply a physical likeness, a record of a mind as much as a face. Whether the drawing is actually a self-portrait has been questioned by some scholars, but its status as the definitive image of Leonardo in popular culture is secure. Leonardo's investigation of light and shadow, which he called chiaroscuro, the Italian term for the interplay of light and dark, was pursued with the same systematic rigor he brought to his anatomical and geological investigations, and his understanding of the way light falls on three-dimensional forms and creates specific patterns of illumination and shadow was fundamental to the extraordinary sculptural quality of the figures in his paintings. He distinguished between primary light, the direct illumination from a light source, and secondary light, the diffused illumination reflected from surrounding surfaces, and he understood that the quality of shadow in a painting was determined not only by the absence of primary light, but by the presence and color of the secondary light filling the shadowed areas. This understanding of the complexity of light in the real world, as opposed to the simple convention of light and dark that governed less sophisticated approaches to painting, is one of the foundations of the visual richness that his paintings continue to communicate across 5 centuries. Leonardo's painting of St. John the Baptist, now held in the Louvre in Paris, and generally considered to be the last painting he completed before his death, shows the saint emerging from a dark background with a smile that has been compared to the Mona Lisa's, and a gesture of the raised index finger pointing upward that appears in several of his late works as a symbol of spiritual transcendence and the connection between the earthly and the divine. The painting is one of his most formally concentrated and most psychologically ambiguous works, the figure's androgynous beauty and enigmatic expression combining with the darkness of the background to create an image that resists easy interpretation and that has generated more sustained, critical and biographical discussion than almost any other work in his output. It is a painting that seems to withhold as much as it reveals, a quality that is characteristic of Leonardo's most personal works and that reflects the depth of the interior life that his notebooks and letters only partially disclose. Leonardo's investigation of the mechanics of the human body extended to the study of movement as well as structure, and his drawings of figures in motion, walking, running, climbing, fighting demonstrate an understanding of the body's dynamic behavior that went far beyond what anatomical study of static specimens could have provided, and that required an additional capacity for the observation and analysis of living bodies in action. He drew horses in motion with the same analytical precision he brought to the drawing of human figures, understanding the mechanics of the quadruped's gait with a clarity that the sequential photography of the 19th century would eventually confirm, and his studies of the way weight shifts through the body during walking and running anticipate the biomechanical analysis of movement that would not be systematically developed until the 20th century. The application of this understanding to his paintings gives the figures in works like The Last Supper a quality of arrested but completely plausible movement that makes them feel caught in a specific moment rather than posed for a downed picture. The relationship between Leonardo and Michelangelo, who were both working in Florence in the early 1500s and who represented the 2 most celebrated artistic reputations in Italy at that time, was marked by a mutual wariness and a degree of personal antagonism that their respective admirers have found variously amusing and unfortunate. Michelangelo was openly contemptuous of Leonardo's failure to complete the Sforza horse and made no attempt to conceal his low opinion of an artist who, in his view, repeatedly allowed his ambitions to exceed his commitment to finishing what he had started. Leonardo, in turn, appears to have found Michelangelo's self-certainty and his almost exclusively sculptural orientation artistically limiting. And the two men's fundamentally different temperaments, Leonardo's exploratory and perpetually questioning, Michelangelo's concentrated and driven, made genuine intellectual sympathy between them, unlikely regardless of the professional context. Leonardo's design for a robot, a mechanical knight that could sit up, move its arms, turn its head, and open and close its visor, produced around 1495 for a court entertainment at the Sforza court, represents one of the earliest and most sophisticated designs for an autonomous mechanical figure in the history of technology, and one that has attracted considerable attention from engineers and roboticists who have studied and in some cases reconstructed it from his drawings. The robot was designed to be operated by a system of cables and pulleys concealed beneath its armor, and reconstructions based on Leonardo's drawings have demonstrated that the mechanism would have functioned as he intended, producing a range of movements sufficiently lifelike to have been genuinely impressive to a court audience in the 1490s. The design reflects the characteristic combination of theatrical ingenuity and mechanical precision that he brought to his designs for court entertainments throughout his time in Milan. Leonardo's notebooks contain extensive observations on the nature of the sun, the moon, and the stars that reflect both his engagement with the astronomical knowledge available in his time and his characteristic tendency to push beyond received wisdom through direct observation and independent reasoning about what the evidence implied. He understood that the moon shines by reflected sunlight rather than by its own light, that the earth would appear luminous from the moon for the same reason that the moon appears luminous from the earth, and that the stars are suns of the same nature as our own sun, located at distances so great that their individual sizes cannot be perceived. These conclusions, which anticipated the astronomical understanding that would be established by Galileo and his successors a century later, were reached through a combination of careful observation, logical deduction, and a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of whether the conclusions it produced were consistent with established opinion. The Annunciation, painted in Florence in the early 1470s and now held in the Uffizi Gallery, is one of Leonardo's earliest surviving paintings, and one that demonstrates both the quality of his achievement as a very young painter and the specific ways in which his approach to conventional religious subjects was already beginning to depart from the established conventions of Florentine painting. The painting shows the Archangel Gabriel appearing to the Virgin Mary in a garden setting, with the two figures separated by a carefully observed marble lectern and placed within a landscape of extraordinary atmospheric delicacy that already shows the characteristic sfumato quality of his later work. Scholars have noted a slight anomaly in the perspective of the Virgin's arm, which appears longer than it should be when the painting is viewed from the front, but resolves correctly when viewed from the right-hand side, suggesting that the painting may have been designed to be seen from a specific angle rather than straight on. Leonardo's investigations into the nature of fossils, the formation of rock strata, and the age of the Earth were conducted at a time when the dominant intellectual framework for understanding the natural history of the planet was provided by the account in Genesis, and his conclusions that the Earth had undergone gradual change over a vast period of time, that mountains had been raised, and seas had retreated through processes still observable in the present, represented a fundamental challenge to that framework, that the intellectual culture of his time was not equipped to accommodate, or to respond to. He made no attempt to publish or broadly disseminate these conclusions, and they remained confined to his notebooks, where they were read by very few people during his lifetime, which means that their historical significance lies not in any direct influence they had on the development of geology, but in what they reveal about the extraordinary independence and reach of his scientific thinking when freed from the verses, constraints of the need to reconcile with established authority. The drawing known as the head of a young woman, also called La Chapigliata, the dishevelled one held in the Galleria Nazionale di Parma, is one of the most beautiful and most discussed drawings in Leonardo's surviving output, showing a young woman's face slightly inclined with her eyes downcast in an expression of extraordinary tenderness and inward absorption that has led many scholars to identify it as a preparatory study for a painting that was never executed. The drawing is remarkable for the quality of the sfumato modelling, achieved here in pencil and paint rather than in oil on panel, that gives the face a luminous depth and atmospheric softness entirely consistent with his painted work, and that demonstrates the degree to which the techniques he developed for painting were continuous with, rather than distinct from his practice of drawing. The identity of the sitter and the purpose for which the drawing was made remain uncertain, adding to the quality of mystery and incompletion that surrounds so much of his surviving work. Leonardo's extended investigation of the proportions of the human face, body, and limbs, conducted through measurement of living subjects, as well as the study of classical theory and his own anatomical dissections, produced a body of knowledge about human proportion that was more systematically grounded in direct observation than anything available in the artistic literature of his time, and that he intended to incorporate into a comprehensive treatise on painting that was never completed. The proportional studies in his notebooks cover an extraordinary range of measurements and relationships: the ratio of the head to the body, the distance between the eyes, the relationship between the length of the nose and the width of the mouth, and they reflect a conviction that the beauty of the human form was not arbitrary, but governed by mathematical relationships that could be discovered through careful measurement, and that the painter needed to understand in order to represent the human figure with the accuracy and elegance that the highest level of his art required. Leonardo spent time in Venice in early 1500, where he was consulted by the Venetian authorities about engineering solutions to the threat of Turkish invasion, and the drawings he made during this visit include a design for a diving suit that would allow a swimmer to approach an enemy ship underwater and bore holes in its hull, a design that has been studied by historians of technology as an early precursor of the modern diving apparatus. The diving suit design shows a leather suit with a breathing tube connected to a float on the water surface, with a bag attached to the suit to collect the diver's exhalations, and it reflects the same combination of practical problem solving and mechanical ingenuity that characterizes his military engineering designs more broadly. Whether the design was ever tested or built is unknown, but its conception demonstrates the breadth of the engineering problems he was prepared to engage with when a patron's practical needs provided the occasion. The unfinished painting of St. Jerome in the Wilderness, now held in the Vatican museums and dating from around 1480, shows the penitent saint kneeling in a rocky landscape with a lion at his feet, the figure's body modelled with an anatomical precision and emotional intensity that reflects Leonardo's developing understanding of the relationship between physical form and inner experience. The painting is unfinished in a particularly revealing way. The figure and the landscape are developed in brown underpaint to a high level of completion, while the final colour glazes were never applied, and it provides an unusually clear picture of the process by which Leonardo built up a composition from the initial drawing through the tonal underpaint to what would have been the final coloured surface. The gaunt, muscular figure of the saint, whose physical form seems to express the spiritual intensity of his penitence through the tension of every visible muscle and tendon, is one of the most powerful figure studies in his surviving work. Leonardo's design for a canal connecting Florence to the sea, bypassing the section of the Arno River that was too shallow for navigation during the summer months, was one of the most ambitious engineering projects he proposed during his Florentine years, and one that he developed in considerable detail in drawings and written calculations that demonstrate both the sophistication of his hydraulic engineering thinking and his practical understanding of the logistical challenges that large-scale construction projects involved. The canal project was never executed, partly because of the political and financial difficulties that accompanied the turbulent period of Florentine history during which it was proposed, but the detailed planning he brought to it reflects a characteristic seriousness about the practical implementation of his engineering ideas that distinguishes him from a purely theoretical designer. He made surveys of the relevant stretch of the Arno and its tributaries, calculated the volumes of earth that would need to be moved, and estimated the costs and time requirements of the project in a way that reflected genuine engineering competence rather than simply visionary aspiration. Leonardo's surviving paintings are distributed across a relatively small number of major institutions, with the largest single holding in the Louvre in Paris, which owns 6 works including the Mona Lisa, the Virgin of the Rocks, the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, the Saint John the Baptist, the Belle Ferronnière, and the Annunciation, a concentration of his work in a single collection that reflects both the historical circumstance of Leonardo's final years in France and the subsequent acquisitions policy of the French royal collection that became the foundation of the Louvre's holdings. The experience of moving through the Louvre's Leonardo rooms, encountering 6 of his surviving paintings in a single afternoon, provides a more comprehensive sense of the range and development of his painted work than any other single museum visit can offer, though the extraordinary popularity of the Mona Lisa and the crowds that it invariably attracts make the experience of looking at the other 5 works a significantly different and, in some respects, more rewarding one. Leonardo's investigation of the eye and the mechanics of vision was driven by the conviction that painting was fundamentally a science of vision, that the painter's task was to understand how the eye perceives the world and to reproduce on the painted surface the same stimuli that the world itself presents to the eye of the observer, so that the painting would produce in the viewer the same experience of seeing that the depicted scene would produce if it were real. This theory of painting as the science of visual illusion shaped his entire approach to the craft and motivated the investigations into optics, perspective, the behavior of light, and the psychology of perception that fill so much of his notebooks. It also explains the extreme slowness and deliberateness of his painting method, the multiple thin glazes, the endless refinement of tonal transitions, the patient building up of the sfumato surface as the practical expression of a commitment to achieving the most perfect possible correspondence between the painted surface and the experience of actual seeing. The small panel painting known as The Musician, held in the Pinacoteca Ambrosiana in Milan and painted around 1485, is the only surviving portrait by Leonardo of a male subject, and one that demonstrates the same quality of psychological penetration and formal sophistication that characterizes his female portraits, though it has attracted less scholarly and popular attention than The Lady with an Ermine or the Mona Lisa. The painting shows a young man holding a sheet of music, his expression combining concentration and a quality of inward absorption that gives the face a psychological depth unusual in male portraiture of the period. The attribution of the painting to Leonardo has been questioned by some scholars who see evidence of workshop participation in certain passages, but the quality of the face, which is generally accepted as autograph, is fully consistent with the standard of his acknowledged works and places the musician among the finest portraits of the Italian Renaissance. Leonardo's notebooks contain designs for a solar power concentrator, a system of concave mirrors arranged to focus sunlight onto a single point for the purpose of generating heat for industrial processes such as the dyeing of textiles, that represents one of the most practically oriented of his energy-related designs, and one that has attracted the attention of historians of technology for its anticipation of solar concentrating technologies that would not be seriously developed until the 20th century. The design reflects Leonardo's characteristic combination of scientific understanding, in this case his knowledge of the optics of curved reflective surfaces, with practical engineering invention, and it represents an attempt to apply the physics of light to a useful industrial purpose that demonstrates how continuously and naturally he moved between pure investigation and practical application in his thinking about the natural world and its possibilities. The baptistery doors of Florence. Gilded bronze panels depicting scenes from the Old Testament made by the sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti and completed in 1452, the year of Leonardo's birth, were described by Michelangelo as the Gates of Paradise, and were one of the most celebrated works of art in Florence during Leonardo's years in the city, representing for him and his contemporaries a model of narrative complexity and formal achievement against which the ambitions of the current generation of artists were inevitably measured. Leonardo's own engagement with narrative complexity in painting the way the Last Supper organizes the psychological responses of 12 individual figures within a single unified compositional scheme reflects the influence of Ghiberti's example and the broader Florentine tradition of complex multi-figure narrative that the baptistery doors represented at its highest level of achievement. The dialogue between sculpture and painting as narrative arts, which Ghiberti's doors made unavoidable for any Florentine artist working in their shadow, shaped Leonardo's thinking about the specific possibilities and challenges of painting as a medium for telling stories about human experience. Leonardo's drawing of the Deluge, a series of late drawings made at the Château du Clos-Lucé in France that depict a catastrophic flood destroying the world in images of extraordinary visual power and emotional intensity, represents one of the most sustained engagements with a single theme in his entire graphic output, and one that has been read by scholars as a reflection of his state of mind in the final years of his life. The drawings show mountains collapsing, cities being overwhelmed by waves, and human figures struggling against a force of natural destruction that reduces all human achievement to insignificance, rendered with a quality of visual energy and compositional complexity that makes them among the most powerful drawings he ever produced. Whether the Deluge drawings represent a scientific investigation of catastrophic natural phenomena, a response to the political and social upheavals of the period, or a more personal meditation on mortality and the transience of human life, they constitute a remarkable final statement from a mind that retained its visual and intellectual powers to the very end. Leonardo's design for an ideal city, developed in the aftermath of the Milan plague of 1484 and 1485, included not only the multi-level urban planning that addressed the practical problems of sanitation and traffic, but also detailed specifications for the dimensions of streets, the minimum height of buildings, and the relationship between residential, commercial, and public space that reflected a comprehensive vision of the city as a designed environment rather than an organic accumulation of individual decisions. The designs were presented to Ludovico Sforza, who found them interesting but ultimately impractical and declined to implement them, preferring incremental improvements to the existing city over the wholesale reconstruction that Leonardo's vision required. The gap between the ambition of the design and the practical and political obstacles to its implementation is characteristic of many of Leonardo's most visionary projects, and it reflects the particular challenge faced by a mind whose capacity for comprehensive systematic thinking consistently exceeded the institutional capacity of his time to implement what that thinking produced. Leonardo's investigation of embryology, conducted through the dissection of pregnant uteruses and the direct observation of embryos at various stages of development, produced drawings of the human fetus in the womb that are among the most remarkable scientific illustrations in the history of biology. accurate in their depiction of the fetal position, the structure of the placenta, and the organization of the umbilical cord to a degree that went far beyond anything available in the medical literature of his time. The drawings are accompanied by written reflections on the nature of the soul and the moment at which it enters the body, questions that the biological evidence he was examining raised in ways that the scientific investigation alone could not resolve, and that connect his embryological work to the broader philosophical and theological questions about the nature of life and consciousness that run through his notebooks as a persistent undercurrent beneath the more specific scientific investigations. The competition between Leonardo and Michelangelo to paint facing murals in the great council hall of the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence, Leonardo, depicting the Battle of Anghiari, and Michelangelo, the Battle of Cassina, is one of the most celebrated artistic competitions in the history of Renaissance art, and one whose outcome was ultimately determined not by the quality of the finished works, but by the practical difficulties that prevented both paintings from being completed. Leonardo worked on his cartoon and began painting the central section of the Battle of Anghiari using an experimental technique of oil on plaster that was intended to give him the slow, reflective working pace he preferred, but that proved disastrously unsuited to the damp conditions of the hall wall. The paint failed to dry properly and began to run when Leonardo attempted to speed the drying process with braziers of hot coals, destroying the central section and effectively ending the project. The cartoon was studied and copied by subsequent generations of Florentine artists before it too was lost, and the Battle of Anghiari is now known only through copies and descriptions. Leonardo's interest in botany was as systematic and as visually precise as his interest in anatomy, and his drawings of plants, their leaf arrangements, their root systems, their flowering structures demonstrate the same quality of sustained and accurate observation that characterizes his drawings of the human body and of geological formations. He was particularly interested in the way plants orient themselves toward light, and in the mathematical patterns, the spiral arrangements of leaves around a stem, the branching patterns of trees that he observed in plant growth, and that he connected to his broader investigation of the mathematical order underlying natural phenomena. The plant drawings in his notebooks are simultaneously botanical records and works of extraordinary visual beauty, and several of the plants depicted in his paintings, the flowers in the foreground of the Annunciation, the vegetation in the backgrounds of his Virgin paintings, reflect the depth and precision of the botanical knowledge that his drawing practice had given him. Leonardo's painting of the Virgin of the Rocks, the version now in the Louvre in Paris, represents one of the most complete realizations of his vision of the relationship between figures and landscape in all of his surviving work. The four figures, the Virgin, the infant Christ, the infant John the Baptist, and an angel arranged within a rocky grotto, whose geological formations are rendered with the same precise observational attention that his geological notebooks demonstrate, and that give the landscape a quality of scientific accuracy unusual in devotional painting of the period. The figures emerge from the surrounding darkness with a quality of atmospheric softness produced by the sfumato technique that makes them seem simultaneously present and intangible, as if they exist at the boundary between the physical world and something beyond it. And the angel's gesture of pointing toward the infant, John introduces a note of narrative complexity and psychological depth that transforms what might have been a straightforward devotional image into something more ambiguous and more intellectually rich. The question of Leonardo's religious beliefs has been debated by biographers and scholars for centuries, with opinions ranging from the view that he was a sincere, if unconventional Christian, to the position that his investigations into natural phenomena had led him toward a naturalistic worldview in which the traditional doctrines of Christianity played little meaningful role. The evidence of the notebooks is ambiguous. He makes occasional references to God and to divine providence that could reflect genuine belief or simply the conventional language of his time, while his insistence on direct observation over revealed authority and his willingness to reach conclusions that contradicted scriptural accounts of natural history suggest a mind whose primary allegiance was to the evidence of experience rather than the authority of tradition. What is clear is that his engagement with religious subjects in his painting was genuine and profound, and that the devotional works he produced, the Virgin paintings, the Last Supper, the St. John, carry a quality of spiritual seriousness that cannot be explained as purely professional or conventional. Leonardo's design for a giant crossbow and his other military engineering designs have sometimes been interpreted as evidence of a cynical willingness to place his abilities in the service of destruction, regardless of the human cost, an interpretation that Leonardo himself appears to have anticipated and, to some degree, resisted in notebook passages where he described the deliberate concealment of certain of his most destructive designs on the grounds that their dissemination would cause more harm than good. Whether this self-censorship was genuine or retrospective is impossible to determine, but the passages in question reflect a genuine awareness of the ethical dimensions of technological invention that is not always associated with Renaissance engineering, and that connects Leonardo's work to contemporary debates about the moral responsibilities of scientists and engineers whose discoveries and designs have the potential to be used for destructive purposes. The Mona Lisa's fame, which by the early 21st century had made it the most visited, most written about, and most reproduced painting in the world, owes a significant debt to a theft that occurred on the 21st of August 1911 when an Italian handyman named Vincenzo Perugia removed the painting from the Louvre by concealing it under his coat and walking out of the past museum with it. The theft generated an enormous international press response that brought the painting to the attention of millions of people who had previously been unaware of it, and the 2 years during which it was missing, it was eventually recovered in Florence in 1913, when Perugia attempted to sell it to an art dealer, contributed to a level of public fascination with the painting that its subsequent return to the Louvre did nothing to diminish. Perugia claimed that he had stolen the painting out of Italian patriotism, believing it had been taken to France by Napoleon, unaware that it had in fact been purchased legally by Francis I from Leonardo himself. Leonardo's understanding of perspective went beyond the linear perspective that had been developed by Brunelleschi and codified by Alberti earlier in the 15th century, to encompass what he called aerial perspective, the systematic way in which the atmosphere reduces the clarity, contrast, and color saturation of objects as their distance from the viewer increases, and color perspective, the specific ways in which colors change in quality and intensity as they recede into the distance. The integration of all three forms of perspective, linear, aerial, and color in his landscape backgrounds gives them a quality of spatial recession and atmospheric depth that no previous painter had achieved with comparable consistency or subtlety. And the misty blue mountains, visible in the distance behind the Mona Lisa and the Virgin of the Rocks, demonstrate the fully realized application of these principles at the highest level of his technical achievement. Leonardo's notebooks contain a series of observations and designs related to the construction of a giant mirror, a concave reflective surface large enough to focus sunlight on a significant area that he conceived as a means of heating water for industrial dyeing processes on a commercial scale, a project that reflects his consistent interest in finding practical applications for the scientific principles he was investigating, and that connects his optical investigations to the engineering ambitions that ran through his work in Psi. every domain he engaged with. The project was never realized, and the practical obstacles to the construction of a mirror of the scale he envisioned would have been formidable with the manufacturing technology available in his time, but the conception demonstrates the characteristic breadth of his thinking about the relationship between natural phenomena and human technology, and the degree to which he regarded the understanding of nature as a resource for the improvement of human practical life, rather than simply as an object of intellectual curiosity. The drawing of the head of Judas that Leonardo made as a study for the Last Supper is described by Giorgio Vasari in a celebrated anecdote in which the prior of the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie complained to Ludovico Sforza that Leonardo was taking too long to finish the painting, and Leonardo responded by telling the Duke that he had been searching for a face of sufficient moral ugliness to serve as the model for Judas, and was considering using the prior himself. Whether the story is literally true or is one of the many anecdotes that gathered around Leonardo's name in the decades following his death, it captures something genuine about the seriousness with which he approached the challenge of finding the right face for each figure in the composition, and the conviction that the moral character of a person was legible in their physical appearance in ways that a perceptive observer could identify and a skilled painter could record and reproduce. Leonardo's time in the service of Cesare Borgia in 1502 and 1503, during which he travelled through the territories of central Italy, making maps and surveys in support of Borgia's military campaigns, gave him a direct experience of the political and military violence of the period that appears to have affected him, and that has been connected by some biographers to the increasing moral seriousness and emotional weight of the work he produced in the years immediately following. The maps he made during the Borgia campaign, including the celebrated bird's-eye view map of the town of Imola that is one of the most precise and most beautiful cartographic works of the Renaissance, demonstrate the extraordinary accuracy and visual intelligence of his geographical observations, but the experience of working in the service of a man whose political methods included assassination and systematic terror must have raised questions about the relationship between technical ability and moral purpose that the notebooks of the period only indirectly address. The Sala delle Asse in the Castello Sforzesco in Milan, a large room whose ceiling Leonardo decorated with a painted arbor of intertwining trees and branches for Ludovico Sforza around 1498, represents one of the most complete surviving examples of his decorative work, and one that demonstrates the characteristic integration of natural observation and formal invention that defines his approach to every domain of visual design. The ceiling creates the illusion of an outdoor space in which the branches of 16 trees interweave across the vaulted surface above the viewer's head, their trunks rooted at the corners and along the base of the walls, their upper branches tied together with golden cords in a complex geometric pattern that combines natural irregularity with formal order in a way that is entirely characteristic of Leonardo's visual thinking. The room was heavily repainted in the 19th century and has been the subject of ongoing conservation work that has revealed more of the original decoration than was previously visible. Leonardo's investigation of the mechanics of flight extended beyond the study of birds to encompass the flight of bats, dragonflies, and other insects, and his drawings of bat wings in particular show a level of anatomical precision and observational accuracy that reflects the same quality of sustained close attention that characterized his anatomical studies of the human body. He was drawn to the bat's wing because its structure, a membrane supported by elongated finger bones, provided a clearer model for a human flying machine than the feathered wing of a bird, and his ornithopter designs reflect the influence of batwing anatomy in their use of a membrane-covered frame rather than a feathered surface. The understanding of aerodynamics that would be necessary to evaluate these designs was not available to him, and the fundamental problem of power-to-weight ratio that would eventually prevent human-powered flight until the late 20th century was one that he could not have identified with the physical knowledge available in his time. The Codex on the Flight of Birds, a notebook of approximately 18 pages now held in the Biblioteca Reale in Turin, contains Leonardo's most concentrated and most systematic treatment of avian flight mechanics and represents the most advanced study of the aerodynamics of bird flight produced before the modern era, combining direct observation of birds in flight with theoretical reasoning about the forces that sustain them in the air and the mechanisms by which they control their movement. He observed that birds use their tails and wings asymmetrically to turn and bank in flight, that they adjust the angle of their wings in response to changes in wind speed and direction, and that the shape of the wing generates lift through the differential pressure of air flowing over its upper and lower surfaces, a principle not formally understood until the development of the aerodynamic theory of lift in the 19th century. The accuracy of these observations reflects the extraordinary quality of his visual attention and the depth of his capacity for systematic reasoning from observed phenomena to underlying principles. Leonardo's late paintings, the St. John the Baptist, the Bacchus that was originally a St. John and was later overpainted by another hand, and the Mona Lisa, in its fully developed state, share a quality of sfumato modeling so extreme that the figures seem to emerge from and dissolve back into the surrounding darkness in a way that gives them an almost immaterial quality, as if they exist at the threshold between the visible and the invisible, rather than as solid presences fully occupying a defined space. This quality of hovering between presence and absence, between the physical and the spiritual, between the knowable and the mysterious, is one of the most distinctive and most discussed features of his late style, and it has been interpreted in various ways as the expression of a Neoplatonic philosophy in which physical beauty is understood as a manifestation of a spiritual reality beyond the physical, as a reflection of the increasingly inward and contemplative character of his thinking in old age, or simply as the logical conclusion of the sfumato technique pushed to its furthest possible development. The Villa Melzi at Vaprio d'Adda, near Milan, the family estate of Francesco Melzi, where Leonardo spent time during the last years of his time in Italy and where the notebooks were housed after his death, is one of the few locations directly associated with his life that retains something of the character it had during the period of his presence there, and visits to the site provide a quality of historical proximity to the circumstances of his later life that the major institutional collections of his work cannot offer. Melzi devoted the years following Leonardo's death to organizing the notebooks and making the Trattato della Pittura compilation, and the care with which he performed this task, imperfect by modern archival standards, but remarkable by the standards of its time, was essential to the survival of the majority of the manuscript material that is now distributed across collections in Milan, Windsor, Paris, Madrid, and elsewhere. The devotion that motivated this work reflects the depth of the personal relationship between the two men that Leonardo's will and Melzi's subsequent actions both attest to. Leonardo's investigation of the mechanics of the arch and the vault, which he pursued in connection with his architectural designs and his engineering projects, produced observations about the distribution of forces in curved structures that reflect a genuine understanding of structural mechanics that went beyond the empirical rules of thumb that governed most architectural practice of his time. He understood that an arch generates horizontal thrust at its base that must be resisted by the abutments on either side, that the geometry of a vault determines the distribution of forces through its structure, and that the stability of a domed building depends on the careful balancing of the outward thrust of the dome against the resistance provided by the walls and buttresses below it. These insights, which anticipate the structural analysis that would be developed formally by engineers in the 18th and 19th centuries, were applied in his architectural designs with a confidence that reflects genuine structural intuition even in the absence of the mathematical tools that formal structural analysis would eventually provide. The question of how many paintings Leonardo actually completed during his lifetime, as opposed to beginning and leaving unfinished, working on collaboratively with his workshop, or planning and never starting, is one that continues to be debated by scholars and that reflects the unusual character of a career in which the gap between ambition and completion was larger and more consistent than in almost any other major artist of comparable stature. The most conservative estimates credit him with fewer than 15 paintings that can be identified as entirely autograph works completed to his own satisfaction, while more generous assessments that include collaborative and partially workshop-executed pieces extend the number to approximately 25. The smallness of the number relative to the length and the reputation of his career remains one of the most striking facts of his artistic life, and one that has generated more biographical and psychological speculation than almost any other aspect of his work. Leonardo's design for a parachute, recorded in a drawing in the Codex Atlanticus and described in an accompanying note as a tent of sealed linen that would allow a man to throw himself from any great height without danger, was reconstructed and tested by the skydiver Adrian Nicholas in the year 2000, who confirmed that the design worked as Leonardo had described it, providing a controlled descent from altitude that, in his test, compared favorably with a modern parachute in terms of the smoothness and stability of the descent. The test provided a dramatic confirmation of the practical viability of one of Leonardo's technical designs that goes beyond the theoretical assessment that most of his engineering drawings have been subject to, and it demonstrated that his understanding of the aerodynamic principles underlying the parachute's function was sufficient to produce a design that would actually have worked if anyone in the 15th century had been willing to test it from sufficient altitude. Leonardo's famous assertion that painting is a science that it is grounded in the mathematical principles of perspective, optics, and proportion, and that a painter who understands these principles is practicing a discipline as rigorous and as certain in its foundations as geometry or astronomy, was a claim made in the context of the ongoing debate about the relative status of the arts and sciences in Renaissance culture, and was intended to elevate painting above the merely mechanical crafts and establish it as a legitimate member of the liberal arts. The argument was not simply self-serving professional advocacy, but reflected a genuine philosophical conviction about the nature of the discipline he was practicing, and the extraordinary range and depth of the investigations he brought to the scientific foundations of painting in optics, anatomy, perspective, and the behavior of light represents the most comprehensive attempt in the history of Western art to make good on the claim that painting and science are fundamentally related activities grounded in the systematic investigation of the natural world. The Royal Collection at Windsor Castle holds the largest single collection of Leonardo's drawings in the world, approximately 600 sheets, containing more than 900 individual drawings, including the celebrated anatomical studies, the geological drawings, the studies of horses and other animals, and a wide range of figure studies and compositional sketches that together provide the most comprehensive picture of his graphic practice available in any single collection. The drawings came to the Royal Collection through a complex history of ownership that included periods in the Melzi family collection after Leonardo's death and subsequent dispersal through various Italian collectors before being acquired, apparently as part of a larger purchase of drawings, by King Charles II of England in the mid-17th century. They have been held at Windsor ever since, and the periodic exhibitions drawn from the collection have provided audiences around the world with their most concentrated encounters with the full breadth and quality of his drawing. Leonardo's relationship with the city of Florence, where he grew up and received his artistic education, but where he spent relatively little of his adult life, was complicated by the same combination of deep attachment and practical restlessness that characterized his relationship with every place he lived, and the city's own ambivalent attitude toward its most famous native son, simultaneously proud of his Florentine identity and frustrated by his habit of leaving commissions unfinished and departing for more welcoming patrons. Elsewhere reflects a genuine tension that runs through the biographical record of his Florentine years. The commission for the Battle of Anghiari, which represented the most prestigious civic commission of his career and which he ultimately failed to complete, crystallized this tension in a particularly public and painful way, and the unfinished mural in the great council hall of the Palazzo della Signoria stood for years as a visible reminder of the gap between Leonardo's extraordinary abilities and his equally extraordinary capacity for leaving things unfinished, when the difficulty of the project exceeded what his perfectionism could accommodate. Leonardo's notebooks were dispersed after Melzi's death in the 1570s through a process of gradual fragmentation that saw individual pages and groups of pages separated from their original contexts and distributed across collections in different cities and countries, a process that makes the reconstruction of the original organization of the manuscripts one of the most complex and most ongoing problems in Leonardo's studies. The 13 major manuscript collections that survive today represent only a fraction of the material that Leonardo produced and that Melzi initially preserved, and the gaps in the surviving record make it impossible to know with certainty what investigations Leonardo pursued, what designs he developed, or what conclusions he reached in the notebooks that have been lost. The surviving manuscripts are extraordinary by any standard, but they represent an incomplete record of a mind whose full scope and depth can only be estimated from the evidence of what has survived. The legacy of Leonardo da Vinci in the centuries since his death has taken forms so varied and so numerous that any attempt to summarize it must inevitably leave more out than it includes the influence on subsequent painting, the anticipation of scientific discoveries, the inspiration of engineers and inventors, the fascination of biographers and psychologists, and the simple fact that 500 years after his death, his name is recognized by virtually every person on Earth who has had any exposure to the history of human achievement. He is simultaneously the painter of the most famous picture in the world and the designer of machines that would not be built for centuries, the anatomist whose drawings were not surpassed for accuracy until the age of medical imaging, and the hydraulic engineer whose understanding of water and its behavior informed designs of extraordinary practical ambition. The range of his achievement across so many domains of human activity is so extraordinary that it remains genuinely difficult to comprehend as the output of a single human life, and the response of simple astonishment that it tends to produce in anyone who encounters it fully is perhaps the most honest and most appropriate response available. Leonardo da Vinci left behind no completed treatise, no finished architectural building of his own design, no bronze sculpture cast, and no flying machine that ever left the ground, and the list of his unfinished and unrealized projects is as extraordinary in its ambition as the list of his completed achievements. And yet, the notebooks, the paintings, the drawings, and the 500 years of response they have generated together constitute one of the richest and most inexhaustible legacies in the history of human thought and human making, a body of work that rewards every level of engagement, from the casual to the scholarly, and that continues to reveal new dimensions and new implications to every generation that brings its own questions and its own ways of seeing to the encounter. The incompleteness is not a failure, it is the honest record of a mind whose curiosity consistently exceeded the time available to satisfy it, and whose questions were, in many cases, better than the answers his time could provide. You can let all of that go now. There is nothing left to hold on to or remember. Somewhere tonight, the Arno is moving quietly through the Tuscan hills, and the stars above the valley are the same stars he watched and wondered about, and the night is deep and still and full of rest.